Did you know that excess belly fat is one of the strongest indicators of diabetes risk? It's not just about appearance. This fat can put your health at risk. Today, we're going to break down how to slim down, improve your health, and reduce your risk of diabetes, specifically type 2 diabetes. Welcome to the Raw Food Health Empowerment Podcast. I'm your host, Samantha Salmon, certified integrative nutrition coach and brain health licensed trainer. And we're going to be talking today about the root cause of belly fat, why it's dangerous for your health, and how you can take practical steps to reduce it naturally and safely. And by the end of today's episode, you'll have actionable strategies to not only slim down, but also lower your risk of diabetes. But before we dive in, make sure that you subscribe to wherever it is you're watching this or listening to this. If you're listening to it on a podcast, subscribe there, or on YouTube, subscribe there. And if you're watching on the podcast, listening or watching on the podcast, please do leave a review. I highly appreciate it. Okay, so a little story time before we get into the main teaching points for today. Some of you may be new to my channel, may be new to me in particular. Just to tell you a little bit about me, I watched my grandmother suffer with type 2 diabetes, right? Literally, like she had to prick her finger every morning to check her blood sugar. And that she was doing that for years before her pancreas couldn't produce enough insulin or any insulin at all. And then she had to get these long needles injected into her stomach with insulin at that point. That lasted about 6 months before her big toe turned black. And 2 weeks from that, she was home on hospice care, dying due to complications from diabetes. Now, when she was first diagnosed with diabetes, my mom met with a nutritionist or dietitian. They're different. They're also different from coaches, right? I know people are not used to coaches, health coaches, and stuff like this. Health coaches are not, unless they have the credential, but the credentialing is different. Nutritionist credentialing is different from dietitian, is different from health coach. And if you want more information on that, I blog a lot about that on rawfoodmealplanner.com. But when my mom was educated by the team that was working to support my grandmother, she basically got very basic information. According to my experience at this point, right? Very basic information. Her diet didn't really change that much, although we did know the fat content needed to come down, I believe, because my mom started to cut the meat, like the fat off the meat when she would prepare it. So she used to make things like lamb chops and chicken and different stuff like this. And she would cut the fat off and she would show me. She would like even melt the fat off. But at one point I don't know if you guys remember, but back in, I think it was like the 90s, or was it early 2000s, that the rotisserie machine was really popular. And the big selling point with the rotisserie machine is that you put the chicken on the skewer and it's cooking it and rotating it, and the oil will just drop, right? All that fat is going to somehow heat up and just drop off. And so you'll have a lower fat content on your meat. I think that was the selling point. But my mom did get that, right? She did get the rotisserie machine. We had all sorts of cooking equipment at home, but she also cut fat off the meat. And it was a whole process. It was the cutting it up and then cutting it off, putting it in plastic bags, put it in the freezer, because I think she wanted to freeze it before she threw it out so it wouldn't smell or something like that. It was a whole process, right? And she thought that was really doing something. Now, my grandma, ultimately, her body, even though she was on the pills, she was taking them at the time she needed to take them, her diet was in alignment with what was being told to us. Her body clearly got progressively worse, right? Where checking blood sugar wasn't enough, the pancreas was failing. So clearly, the demands on the pancreas was still there. So something was amiss there, right? If you have these heavy demands and now the pancreas is basically puttering out, it can no longer operate. And so then she needed the insulin shots. And then that wasn't enough because now she's dealing with potentially an amputation, which I'm assuming at the time she was in her 80s. And I was a young person when my grandma passed away. It was like my first year of college. I had just turned 18, right? So I'm assuming at this point, since I wasn't right in communication with her doctors, that they felt like she was just too old and her body was not couldn't handle a surgery to get rid of that. So we didn't even get the option for amputation. She was dying. And even her process of dying was slow and painful. They had her on a gurney in the living room with a catheter in her. And for those who aren't aware, a catheter is basically a line they put up into the hole where you urinate from so that you don't have to move around. And she was screaming out that it was burning her. And she was on hospice for 2 weeks. So it's not like she was wearing it for that long. I'm not sure how long you're supposed to wear it, but she was screaming out in pain that it was burning her. And on hospice, they have like palliative care and they give you certain things to make you feel as comfortable as possible. But based on her screams, she was not comfortable, but she wanted to live. That was very clear. She wanted to live and she wasn't really given that choice. And then 4 years after that point is when I found Dr. Neil Barnard's book for Dr. Neil Barnard's program for reversing diabetes. That's the name of the book. And reading this book, right, I realized some things. One, we weren't given this information that could have potentially saved her life. Because in the book, I was reading that you can reverse type 2 diabetes, which is what my grandmother had for almost 2 decades. We could have reversed it in 2 weeks with a whole food, plant focus, exclusive diet, right? And so that was the first thing, that we weren't told and that there was a possibility. The second thing that happened to me was like, I saw what my grandma went through. I don't want that for myself. So I decided to go 100% vegan after reading this book. And at the time, I didn't like vegetables at all, right? Anything green I didn't like, including avocados, just anything green. I can't even remember anything else that wasn't green that I didn't like, but I know for sure all things green, I wasn't a fan. And so I went vegan, but continued to basically eat. I continued to eat the way that I like to eat all the stuff that I like, but just not eat the meat, dairy, eggs. I was pretty convinced by reading Dr. Neil Barnard's book that meat, dairy, eggs would lead to type 2 diabetes. And I felt in my head that I would basically be on the same track to experience all the things I watched my grandma experience. When I changed my diet, I had my last ceremonial meal at Whole Foods with some hot wings that I was in love with, basically, at Whole Foods, that I used to eat all the time. And so I had my last ceremonial meal and I took my time with it because I knew that would be the last time that I would eat meat. And I basically was vegetarian for 2 weeks after that, and then vegan ever since that. That was back in 2008. Okay. Now, the thing is, though, when I went completely vegan, right? So I cut out dairy, cut out meat, eggs. I wasn't really into eggs like that. As a youth, I used to bake. So I used eggs when I baked, but I always had a prejudice against eggs as a young person. Even though I used it to bake, I just was so confused. Isn't this a baby chicken? I used to have this conversation with my mom all the time because my brain was trying to make sense. With the chicken, I used to eat as a young person. I used to eat chicken cutlets and stuff like this. So what you're eating doesn't look like the animal. So in my head, there was no connection. But the egg looked like an egg. And I'm like, animals come from eggs. So how am I not eating a fetus right now? And so I remember I asked my mom that question all the time. And my mother, I'm not sure about other people's mothers, but my mother, sometimes when she doesn't know the answer and she's not really trying to like engage in lengthy conversations that I guess she feels is not worthy of her time, she'll just come up with something to finish it. And she said stuff, but whatever she said never stuck because it always bothered me. But I still like the recipes that I would use because I used to do the Jiffy box, like cornbread, and they had like brownies, and I would read the instructions and follow the instructions, and they all called for eggs. So I used egg, but it's not something I did regular because that was like maybe summer break or weekend or something like this. I was too busy in school to really have that on a regular basis, but I was prejudiced against that. And then I also very prejudiced against fish because in my family, I come from a Jamaican family, and I had a nanny who's also from Jamaica, from Kingston. And just about almost every adult I know, every Jamaican adult I know, including my nanny, I watch them choke on fish bones, right? And I'm like, this food is dangerous. So when I ate fish, I would get filet. And so that would, of course, come from Costco, the box filet stuff, typically breaded and all that. Processed, basically. I would call that now a processed food because it's so far removed in terms of the look of it. It's so far removed from actual fish. Plus, in my household, they used to have the fish on the plate. I remember, and I remember in my head like it was yesterday, on the counter with the head on. So you see the whole fish, right? With the head and the eyes and everything, and it's looking at you. And I'm like, how you could eat something looking at you like that? Like so even as a young child, these things I just was prejudiced against. I just felt it wasn't safe and it was too much. It was too close. Like my brain could not disassociate the fact that I was eating a fetus or eating an animal, eating something that had a life, had parents, has children, was part of a family constellation. It bothered me. But the other stuff, like when my mom made pork chops, I couldn't even tell you what animal that was coming from because I didn't grow up on a farm. Nobody was talking to me about any of this stuff. I grew up in Queens, New York. So I only knew what was in my neighborhood, which is what? Popeyes, McDonald's, definitely, because McDonald's was a regular in my youth. Every Saturday I would go to McDonald's. That's most of my toys came from McDonald's, right? So they had me in the bag. I was looking forward because I was building up my toy chest. But anyway, when I went vegan, what ended up happening was I gained 20 pounds. And I've always been a chubby child. I come from a family on both sides of folks who clearly, I know now, have insulin resistance. And basically, insulin resistance is the mechanism that causes type 2 diabetes. It's when basically you have so much saturated fat filling up your fat cells. Because when you're born with all the fat cells your body will ever use. You're not making new fat cells, right? But think of them as like empty suitcases, right? And so every time you eat some fats, not all fats, right? Every time you eat certain types of fats, these fat cells fill up. Sometimes they fill up so much that the fat is spilling out and causing all sorts of problems, right? At that point, you're probably severely overweight, obese, all this kind of stuff. Now, as a child, I was always chubby. I basically, maybe at stages of my life where I shouldn't have been 120, I was pretty much 120. My mom always bought big clothes because, in the Jamaican West Indian household or households, families, there's this thing where in the culture where it's like you'll grow into the clothes or something like this. So I always had big, baggy clothes, but I always was really chubby. And it showed because I did dance. I did dance from I was 3 all the way to like end of high school. I would do performances and I performed at some really nice places, Madison Square Garden and Lincoln Center and all these different places, right? With my dance school, right? So in dance, and I particularly remember my younger years of 8, 9 years old, the leotards they have you wearing is pretty fit. You're wearing a one piece and every role you have is showing, right? And at a certain point, baby weight is no longer an excuse because especially when you start to get into your preteens and teenage years, you have a lot of self-consciousness, right? You're looking at you, other people are looking at you, and you're feeling some type of way. And then we have media showing us certain things that, like, okay, this is what's acceptable and this is not acceptable. And of course, in the dance world, my dance school was always like it's in Queens, and my area was predominantly Black, predominantly West Indian. And so I had peers that looked like me, but not necessarily as chubby and fat as I am, but they were all from Black culture. So even within Black culture, beauty standards about how fat or slim you should be is a little bit different than the mainstream. But I think even in our culture at that time, now it's changed a lot, but at that time, having rolls upon rolls just was not the look. So anyway, I was self-conscious about it, but I wasn't unique in this. Like my mom, when I was young, my mom and I, we used to do workouts together. She was very much into being fit, healthy, and looking good. She was always concerned about her weight. Aunts I've had the same, who basically policed my eating, because I'm not even um attacking them for it, because I think they did a really great job. I remember one aunt in particular, for breakfast, I was going straight to the pantry to get chips, and she railed at me. She was like, "You are not eating chips for breakfast." They were in the house. It wasn't like she was saying we could never have chips, because we had chips at her house all the time, even at my house. But it was like, you don't eat that for breakfast. There has to be some kind of rules. She just felt like that wasn't the right way to raise a child, right? Which, and I'm not in disagreement on that at all. But this is the environment that I was raised in. So anyway, when I gained 20 pounds going vegan, I felt like this is the wrong direction, because I'm eating this way to avoid type 2 diabetes, but I'm not doing it to sacrifice my physique. And I figured as much, that it was because that I basically ate all the things that I liked, sans the meat, dairy, eggs. And I pinpointed, or felt like I had suspected, that basically the bread that I was eating, because I was eating a lot of pasta and a lot of bread, was making me gain the weight. So I decided to try and eat more fruits and vegetables, or specifically vegetables, because I was eating fruits and things. But the vegetables I definitely wasn't eating, because I didn't like greens. I didn't like any vegetables at the time, or so I claimed. Some of the stuff I had never even tried, like avocado. I just assumed I wouldn't like it. I watched my family eat it. In Jamaica, they call it pear. And I just, because it was green and mushy, I just said no. I swore I wouldn't like it, but I had never really tried it. And so I saw and learned about the raw food lifestyle, right? It was pretty popular on YouTube at the time. And there was a lot of folks saying basically you can eat as much as you want and not gain weight. And so I decided to lean into that, starting with green smoothies, right? Trying to get myself into a place where I would actually like the vegetables. And that basically started my raw food journey. With raw foods, I was able to lose 15 pounds. So not just get back to 25 pounds, not just get back to my weight that I was used to being at as a youth, but actually 5 pounds even less than that. Dropped a jean size, which had never happened to me before. I never thought it was even possible. But now I understand more about science, that even in your muscles, there's fat in there. So when you start to lose fat, there's areas where you will lose fat that you didn't even know there was fat there to be lost. But so that was my entry point into raw food eating, right? And why I eat a high raw vegan diet is because, as someone who leans insulin resistant, mostly because there's certain things about our body physiology that would be really hard to change because of genetics, specifically epigenetics. And there's a workshop that I do on brain reserve, which talks about extra brain tissue that we have that allows us to be more resilient when stress comes up. But not all of us come into this world with the same amount of brain reserve. Adding on top of that, past traumas that have happened in our family line, our set point for stress and our ability to cope, like what would trigger a cortisol increase, which is basically your stress hormone, which then when we have high cortisol, we have high insulin. It's triggering insulin. When we're heavily chronically stressed, it triggers insulin, right? For a biological reason, right? Which I explain in a lot of my trainings why the body would do this. But the body does do this. And because of that, some of us, this is why this not every diet is the right for everyone. And I agree, as long as we're talking in the realm of our species specific diet, because you can't go to an herbivore like cows, for example. Cows are herbivores, right? And if you read this book, there's a really great book called Animal Factory by David Kirby. It will make you sick to your stomach. Cows eat grass, and yet they fed these cows in the Midwest dead cows and other dead animals, right? And that's how we ended up with mad cow disease, right? We created mad cow disease from mad behavior. And this is what humans, especially Americans, are going through right now, eating a non-species specific diet, right? But in that realm, there are different ways to eat based off of your bodily needs. Some people thrive high fat, some people thrive high protein, some people thrive more with high sugars, right? And it's different. I've done 2 summits that really outline that, where you have all these people eating within our species specific diet, but they're doing it in various ways that serve their body. And so in this realm, for me, from my own personal experience of what I witnessed, the science and also the emotional experience of watching what my grandmother went through, but the science convinced me to change my diet to be in alignment with my species specific diet. And then raw foods helped me to release excess fat and bring my body into a place where it could be in homeostasis, into a healthy stage, especially given my natural set point, right? Not everyone has the set point that I have, right? Some people, they need a lot coming at them, way more, maybe 10 times more than me, in order for a cortisol surge, right? Whereas for me, my resiliency is not there. And that's just built in. Of course, now in my program, Conquer Your Cravings, we go through a lot of stuff to heal the brain from a biopsychosocial spiritual approach to mitigate for that. And for folks like myself, if you're being triggered to anger, rage, tiredness, fatigue, loneliness, chronic low mood, that type of thing, there are techniques to support yourself there are other people, maybe even in your family, who share your kitchen, who share your fridge, who their bodies don't respond to life the same way yours is responding, right? So the tools they need may look different. The way they can eat may look different. Even if you have everybody on the same page in terms of eating our species specific diet, that doesn't mean everyone in the household is eating the same way. So anyway, this is how I found what works for me. And this is why I love coaching, because I help my clients basically find out where to maneuver for their diet to support them for where their body is at this moment. Because it's going to change. In my 20s, the way I ate was very supportive of the health of my body, and I felt great. Now in my late 30s, it's different. My dietary pattern is different than when I was in my 20s, to be more supportive of where my body's at now, where my hormones are at, where my stress level is at, right? Especially you go through life. First of all, the female body is just not the same at every decade. It's going through a ton of changes. But also, life stressors come at you a little bit different based off of where you are and what you've been through. So our gut microbiome, basically your gut, which is managing the health of your whole entire body, is changing every season, but also with every different stage of life. It's being affected by so many things that it's most likely that your diet is not going to stay the exact same at each phase, right? So now back to this topic about belly fat. Belly fat specifically is super dangerous because this is where most of your vital organs are. And so having a lot of excess fat in the midsection just puts a lot of strain on these vital organs and sets you up to be on path to type 2 diabetes, heart disease, metabolic issues, right? And that's a specialty that I deal with, is metabolic health, which is basically looking at the health of really how the body is working with all our metabolic functions. Like metabolism is basically how your whole body is running, how your brain is functioning and running, the nutrients that you're absorbing from your body, your hormonal regulation, including thyroid hormones, cholesterol, insulin, all of that is affecting how your body's able to run and do all the things that it needs to do. So that in a nutshell is basically your metabolic health. So I already explained, like when you are high stress, right? You have high cortisol, that triggers high insulin. Now, stress sometimes is not just psychological, sometimes it's physical. Sometimes the foods we're eating, the things we're doing, even certain exercises can increase cortisol, can increase more stress on the body. Inflammation is another one. If you have high inflammation, that is causing a lot of stress on the body. And this puts you at risk for insulin resistance and can disrupt hormonal balance, right? So if you are dealing with weight gain and you're worried about your health, you're worried about inflammation in the body, then I really want to pinpoint something that I think just about anybody on every diet can agree, is that the enemy here is ultra processed foods. Okay. Now, I read an article recently. I think it was, what was the article? It was New York Post wrote a piece about a recent study that was published in September by the Lancet Regional Health in Europe, right? So they were basically saying that ultra processed foods, we know it drives diabetes and other chronic diseases like obesity, cardiometabolic diseases, which includes your cardiovascular system, how that's running, and some cancers, right? And what are these ultra processed foods that they found? Because they basically did a test on all the ultra processed foods, and they were looking at which ones are doing the worst work on the body. And so they pinpointed 4, which are savory snacks. So think chips, okay? Which comes up a lot in my community, is the chips. It's not even so much the sweet cookies and stuff like that. It's chips. Also, animal-based products, especially processed meats, ready-to-eat meals, and sugar-sweetened beverages, or beverages that have an artificial substitute. So there's some chemicals basically in there. And they found that specifically these 4 are doing the most damage in terms of advancing people to diabetes, obesity, cardiometabolic disease, and cancer. Okay, so the researchers, they analyzed the consumption of ultra-processed foods for nearly 312,000 people from 8 European countries, which I thought this was super interesting because my time in Europe, specifically, because I know Britain talks about their obesity issue all the time, and I understand they're having issues. India also has been complaining about obesity. China is just now starting to complain about obesity being an issue there because there's a lot of the American diets and some of the fast food chains have migrated over and expanded to that area. And so the diet that used to be very healthy for them, they're no longer eating. They're eating more of the American style. So I know in that part of the world, right, across the Atlantic, obesity is an issue. But however, when I go to Poland in particular, I rarely see an overweight person. It's rare for me to see that. I see a ton of smoking. I'm not saying these people have no issues or no health issues or whatever, because heart disease apparently is one of their like top health problems, right? Stress is everywhere across the globe, right? But I rarely see overweight or obesity. So this was really interesting that this study, they looked at 8 European countries and they tracked these people for 11 years on average. And during that time, they found that 15,000 people developed type 2 diabetes. So the study authors, they linked every 10% increase in ultra processed foods leads to a 17% rise in diabetes risk. I don't think anybody's really surprised here about this study in particular and what they found. The article went on to say that among the people who ate the most ultra processed foods, where the foods made up nearly a quarter of their diet, sweetened beverages accounted for nearly 40% of the ultra processed food intake and 9% of their overall diet. This I'm also not surprised, because I've literally spoken to people who visually I can tell that by the medical charts. Some people it's hard to tell, but some people you can clearly see that per the medical charts, what they would consider to be overweight and obese, you can visually see what that looks like, right? And even I've been in the kind of like bodybuilding spaces where people are really trying to not just get into a healthy range with their diet, but they're specifically looking at body fat goals to have a certain cut to compete on stage. And so with this thing, you're literally looking at the body um, through a certain lens, and you see when you keep looking at bodies through this lens, you notice, you can almost pinpoint and look at a body and say, oh, you're at 20 something percent body fat. You're at 15% body fat, right? When you study it and you look at it and you look at enough bodies, right? And you're in that world all the time, you can visually see. So for me, with the medical charts, because I've been doing this for a while, I've been coaching people on weight loss for a long time. Since 2016 is when I started coaching. I can see based on the charts and visually see who would be where, right? And I have talked to people who clearly are overweight and they drink soda all the time. And they say, I have no health issues. I have no health issues. And they weren't necessarily clients, right? They were just people, community members, different people in the community. And so I'm not going to have a health conversation with them. But in my head, I'm like, clearly, I could see how maybe, yeah, you don't have anything glaring, but this is how people really feel like they get caught off guard. Because when it comes to dementia in particular, it takes about 40 to 50 years before you get a diagnosis. It takes 10 years before you get a diagnosis of cancer. It takes 7 years before you get a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, right? This stuff is not an overnight thing, right? The body can handle but so much toxic load. And at a certain point, things accumulate to the point where now you're in crisis mode diagnosis level, right? This is like danger. You have stepped over into the danger zone. And to me, not to say that it's too late, because it's never too late, but I feel like, dang, why did it have to get so bad? But that's what we know and understand based on neuroscience, right? And human behavior, psychology, that when it comes to unhealthy food addiction, which is the land we're in now, when we start to talk about these processed foods, if I tell you that the refined sugar and these processed foods are damaging your body and leading to disease, and you don't quit it, then you have some kind of emotional connection to this food. This is a coping mechanism for something. You're holding on to this like a crutch, like an emotional, psychological crutch for something. Now we're in the land of addiction work, right? How do we extricate yourself from this unhealthy substance so that you can get to a place of health and cope with stress without using these substances, right? But what we know from addiction work is that for some people, they need to hit rock bottom, and even rock bottom, there has to be even a crater for them to fall lower before they're inspired intrinsically to make a change. This article went on to mention high amounts of sugar in the blood have been shown to damage cells, which causes chronic inflammation. It's associated with heart disease, diabetes, liver disease, and cancer. Like literally, with this refined sugar, we are losing our vital organs, right? So in terms of the lifestyle piece, like we know from a dietary component, we need to extricate ourselves from these ultra processed foods. We need to start eating whole foods, right? We also need to be more active, right? A lot of us are very sedentary, but we're telling ourselves, I don't have the time, right? You may be telling yourself, I don't have the time, Or maybe you're even telling yourself something like you have an injury or something, so you don't feel safe, which makes a lot of sense. That's why in my program, in my Conquer program, I pair my client with a trainer that you physically meet with in person, because these are valid concerns. If you have an injury that you want to work around, like, the body needs to move always. And I don't know if you just watched the Paralympics, but to me, like, the Olympics is great, but the Paralympics should be broadcasted everywhere. This is like your motivation to, regardless of what you feel you're missing, you need to be working out and moving the body every day, because the body wants to move. It thrives on that. This is how you keep your mental health on the up and up, right? This is how you keep joy in your life, right? And continue the motivation to eat clean and be your best self, right? It has a domino effect in terms of our life and what we go after for our health and longevity, right? It's so much that it's doing psychologically for us because of the effects on the brain. Honestly, from a digestive standpoint, activity is great for healthy digestion. But for me personally, the working out has so much to do with our psychological health that, to me, that is like, this is what really motivated me to make sure I don't miss a week without working out. I can't say I don't miss a day, because technically, even the days that I don't go for a long walk or I don't go to the gym, I do a lot of movement walking around at home. And because there are days where the body wants to rest, and you're going to get a lot of gains from that, depending on where you are. I noticed for my body that I experience some great fat loss in particular when I allow myself time to rest and time to do heavy training. And specifically for me, I do progressive overload. So I'm doing like heavy, like, weight training and not too much HIIT style workouts and stuff like that. But also too, as we talk about belly fat and getting healthier and staving off type 2 diabetes, we need to think about hormonal factors, right? So insulin resistance, if we have high insulin, we're going to have a lot of belly fat storage, right? If we have high cortisol, or even leptin and ghrelin are off balance, right? Our fat distribution is going to be a little bit off. So we want to make sure that metabolically we are healthy, that all our hormones are in balance at a healthy level. So I mentioned earlier how I slimmed down to reduce my own belly fat, right? And it was basically through specifically a raw vegan diet, right? But I didn't have to stay there 100% in order to maintain that weight loss. You don't have to. It really depends on how your body is doing and responding to certain types of foods, given your metabolic set point, the set point of your stress levels. All of this matters in the full scheme of things. But the fiber, the anti-inflammatory foods, the fact that you're eating foods rich in water, this helps to keep the digestive system running clean. It keeps the hormones balanced, and that includes insulin. Insulin is a hormone, right? And you're not consuming anything to make your pancreas overwork, right? Because the foods that you're eating are in healthy, complete balance. You're not consuming these ultra processed foods and these chemicals to disrupt all of that. Now, as I mentioned before, physical activity we know is important, but we don't do it because we say we don't have the time. And I would really challenge you on that do you have the time not to do it, right? If you being active on a daily basis meant that you would make more money, which in my trainings, I show you how you can make more money by being active. Because basically, the way the brain works is that it needs blood flow, right? And when you strength train in particular, you make your cerebellum bigger, right? So your capacity to be smarter and to make wiser choices, right, is predicated upon you being active, movement in some shape or form on a regular basis. So this is linked to how you show up at work, at home, in your community, right? Your capacity to be as successful as possible is all dictated on this. So why would you not, right? Make the time for physical activity. Plus, it supports in stress management, it helps you sleep, and all of this helps you release the fat from your midsection. Now, if you want to get started, you want to get started with eating foods that are full of water, that help to detoxify the body, right? With more fiber, more water, more nutrients, and anti inflammatory foods. I have a special gift for you. It's the Healthy Digestion recipe book for weight loss and chronic pain relief. The link for that is in the show notes or the description to this video. So you can go and download that and get your feet wet with this concept of what it would look like to eat cleaner, to stave off type 2 diabetes, if you're pre-diabetic, to reverse that diagnosis and to relinquish the fat off your midsection, right? You are going to get there faster with the proper nutrition than with exercise. Exercise, you will run yourself into the ground trying to exercise fat off your body. Without doing the nutrition piece, good luck finding a result. I did that for a long time in my youth before I cleaned up my diet, and the scale did not move. My body didn't really change. I just grew, right? So I went from a chubby child to a teenager that was taller and bodied because of fat distribution, right? But it's not like I lost that fat, right? I just grew. So it had to distribute itself. So it was less obvious. I didn't have rolls on my midsection because it just distributed out to my hips, to my butt, and all those different places. But we are specifically concerned, like, the fat on your behind or your thighs and stuff is of little consequence. Like, being concerned about cellulite and all this stuff, this is really a vanity, like they say online with social media, it's a vanity metric, right? This is not really linked to any kind of health marker. But visceral fats, right? Visceral fat is the kind that is like wrapping itself around the organs. That's the dangerous stuff that we want to get rid of, right? And nutrition, clean nutrition is going to help you get there. So I would love to help you because I know that the food stuff, you already know what you should be doing, but you probably have some challenges. Can I even eat this way and enjoy it? I heard somebody say, even on the article, there was a ton of commentary where someone said, how about I just jump off a roof? Ketchup on a hot dog? Man, I'd rather be dead than follow these lunatics. That, like, someone literally said that. And you know what? We really need to be careful what we ask for, because eating this way does lead to death. We already know that. We've witnessed lots of death during the pandemic with folks who this was part of their normal diet. And this stuff, like, when you start thinking along these lines, like, I'd rather jump off a roof than give up ketchup and hot dogs, you are in a state of food addiction, right? Where you'd rather die than give up chemicals and processed foods. So sit with that, right? So if you're ready to deal with that, I can help you in my Conquer program, but you can get your feet wet right now with this recipe book and start making some of this stuff in the kitchen right now. All right. So I cannot wait to talk to you next time. And I would love to hear in the comments below this video, if you're watching on YouTube, how did you like the recipes? Try the recipes and report back, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.